The mill had been dying for 30 years before anyone thought to sell it. It sat at the edge of Callow Creek, where the water ran brown and slow in summer and rose to an angry froth each November, swallowing the lower footpath and licking at the stone foundation like something that had waited a long time to take what was owed to it. The wheel had not turned since 1991. The gears had seized. The millstone cracked clean through in a winter that nobody in Hallows Bend remembered fondly, and after that, the Pruitt family, who had owned the gristmill for 4 generations, simply stopped pretending they intended to fix it. The property went to auction on a Tuesday in early March, when the sky above the county courthouse sat low and colorless, and the cold came through every coat. When there were 11 people on the courthouse steps when the auctioneer began. By the time he reached the Callow Creek Gristmill, parcel number 47, on a list of 53 distressed and foreclosed properties, there were 4. 3 of those 4 were holding coffee cups they had not opened. One of them was Elena Voss. She was 31 years old. She had $11.42 in her checking account, a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and a daughter named Margot, who was 7, and who had, 3 weeks earlier, asked her mother in complete seriousness whether they were going to have to move into Grandma's car. Elena's mother did not have a car. She had a 1-bedroom apartment in a building that had been condemned twice and uncondemned twice, and whose superintendent had not responded to a maintenance request since the previous administration. But Margot did not know that, and Elena had smiled and said, "Of course not, sweetheart," and then gone into the bathroom and run the water so Margot would not hear. The auction for the gristmill opened at $9. Nobody bid. The auctioneer, a man named Carl Dukes, who had been doing this for 22 years and had the face of someone who had seen every variety of human error and found none of it particularly surprising, looked up from his clipboard and asked if there were any takers. He looked at the woman in the green wool coat who had been staring at the property listing for the better part of 20 minutes. She raised her hand. $9. The gavel came down. But Elena Voss drove home with a deed to a piece of property she had never set foot on, in a county she had only visited once as a child, having paid $9 for the privilege. She told herself it was an investment. She told herself a lot of things in those first days, the kind of quiet, interior conversations that people have when they've done something the rational part of their mind cannot entirely justify, and the irrational part refuses to apologize for. She had found the listing on a county website at 2 in the morning, the night Margot had cried herself to sleep because there was no money for the field trip. Elena had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and a pile of bills she had already arranged by how overdue they were, a habit she'd developed because it made her feel like she was doing something even when she wasn't. The listing had been buried under foreclosed hardware stores and collapsed barns. The photograph attached to it showed a stone building beside a creek, its wheel visible but motionless, its windows intact, its walls still standing after a century and a half of Novembers. The listing said, "Mill property, approximately 1.4 acres, waterway access, existing structure. Assessed value, 0. Opening bid, $9. She had stared at it for a long time. She had not told anyone she was going to bid. She had not told her sister Darlene, who would have said, "Elena, you cannot afford to own property. You can barely afford to own a car. You need to think about Margot." She had not told her friend Rosalind, who worked at the county assessor's office and who would have pulled up the file and said, "Elena, this place hasn't had electricity since 2004. The road to get there is seasonal, and the mill wheel is a safety hazard." She had not told her mother because her mother would have cried, and crying was a currency Elena could not afford to spend on herself right now. She had told Margot, not all of it, not the part about $9, or the fact that she had exactly zero plan for what to do with an abandoned gristmill. She had told Margot that she was looking at a piece of land with an old building on it, beside a creek, and Margot had said, "Does it have fish?" And Elena had said, "Probably." And Margot had said, "Can we go see it?" And Elena had said yes. And that had been enough. It had been enough for both of them. So the drive to Callow Creek took 45 minutes from the motel they were staying in, the kind of motel that advertised weekly rates on a sign out front and had vending machines on every floor, but ice machines on none. Elena drove it on a Saturday morning with Margot in the back seat, eating a granola bar and narrating the scenery in the particular exhausting way that 7-year-olds had of narrating things, which was to say, with complete attention to every individual cow and tree and fence post, and zero attention to anything that might be considered summary or context. The road to the mill was unpaved for the last mile and a half. The Civic complained about this, but survived. When they crested the small rise and the property came into view, Margot stopped narrating and pressed her face against the window. Though the building was bigger than Elena had expected, the photograph had flattened it somehow, made it seem smaller and more defeated than it was. In person, the stone walls had a density to them, a presence that came from being built before anyone alive had been born. The mortar between the stones had been replaced at some point in the last 30 years, visible in certain sections, where the color was slightly lighter, slightly less weathered. The roof had been repaired, too, or at least partially. Someone in the Pruitt family had cared about this place for a long time before they stopped. The wheel was on the south side, visible from the road. It was enormous, 8 feet across, maybe more. Its wooden paddles had rotted in places, but the iron framework at its center was intact, holding the shape of the wheel even where the wood had given way. The creek moved beneath it with a sound that Elena could hear from the car with the windows rolled up. A low and steady rush, older than the building, older than anything human that had ever been placed beside it. They got out. Margot ran toward the creek immediately, as though pulled by the sound of it, and Elena called after her to stay back from the edge, and Margot said, "I know." Mom and continued at the same speed. Elena turned and looked at the building. The front door was padlocked. She had the key from the courthouse, a small iron thing on a ring with a tag that said, "Parcel 47," and it took 3 attempts before the lock turned. The hinges protested. The door swung inward, and the smell of the place came out to meet her. Not a bad smell. Not rot or mold, or the kind of decay that meant structural failure, but something older and drier, unlike the inside of a book that had been closed for decades. Dust. Stone. The memory of grain. She stepped inside. The main floor was a single large room, high-ceilinged, the ceiling itself partly exposed beam and partly the underside of the floor above. The light came through 4 windows, all intact, all filmed with 20 years of grime that softened the light rather than blocking it. She could see the millstone through an opening in the floor, or what remained of it, the cracked halves sitting in the pit below the main level, resting against each other, like something that had given up mid-task and simply stopped. Dust lay over everything in a layer that recorded every air current, every vibration, every movement. She was the first person to disturb it in a very long time. There was a staircase on the north wall, narrow, wooden, leading up to the second level, which had been used as storage. She tested the first 3 steps. They held. She went up. The upper floor was low and long, and smelled more strongly of grain, the ghost of it soaked into the wood over 150 years. Wooden bins lined the far wall, empty now, their interiors scrubbed clean by time. A rusted scale sat on a rough shelf. Beside it, a handwritten ledger, its cover swollen with old moisture, its pages stuck together in a solid block. She left it where it was. There was a 3rd level. Not a full floor, more of a loft, accessible by a ladder rather than a staircase. She looked up at it and then went back down to check on Margot, who had found a stick and was using it to push leaves down the creek and watch them travel. She stood in the doorway of the gristmill and looked at her daughter, and at the creek, and at the wheel, and for reasons she could not have explained clearly at the time, she felt something settle inside her. Not hope, exactly. Not certainty. Something quieter than both of those. More like recognition. Like the feeling of turning a corner and finding yourself somewhere you have somehow always known you were going to be, without ever being able to say how you knew. She told herself it was the cold air and the sound of the water. She drove home and Googled what to do with an abandoned gristmill. The information was not particularly encouraging. Restoring a functional gristmill required anywhere from $100,000 on the absolute low end to well over $1 million, depending on the condition of the wheel mechanism, the integrity of the millstone mounting system, the state of the water diversion infrastructure, and approximately 40 other variables that Elena did not have the vocabulary to fully understand yet, but was learning. She read for 3 hours. She took notes in a composition notebook that Margot had abandoned after a school project. She read about millwright certifications and historic preservation grants and waterway easements and the structural difference between a tub wheel and an overshot wheel, which the Callow Creek mill appeared to be based on the photograph she had taken that morning. She fell asleep with the notebook on her chest and the laptop screen still glowing. In the morning, she called Darlene. Darlene took it better than expected, which is to say, she said, "Are you out of your mind?" only once. And then she said, $9? And Elena said $9. And there was a pause, and Darlene said, "I mean, that's $9, Elena." And Elena said, "I know." And Darlene said, "I guess it's $9. And that was as close to a blessing as Darlene gave about most things. Then she called Rosalind, who pulled the assessor's file and called her back in 20 minutes. "Okay," Rosalind said. "The property has been in tax delinquency for 11 years. The Pruitt estate paid the back taxes twice and then stopped. The building itself passed its last structural inspection in 2009, which means it was sound enough at that point. But that's 17 years ago. The millstone apparatus is listed as non-functional due to mechanical failure and water diversion damage. There's a notation about the waterwheel chamber." Elena sat up. "Well, what kind of notation?" "It just says inspection limited, access restricted due to water intrusion and structural concerns. Basically, whoever did the inspection couldn't get into the waterwheel chamber and didn't push it." "What's the waterwheel chamber?" Rosalind was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, exactly. My guess is it's the enclosed space around the base of the wheel mechanism, the part that's partially below water level. Some of those old mills had enclosed chambers to protect the gear assembly and the lower axle mounting from flooding. It would have been a sealed stone room, basically." Elena wrote this down. Waterwheel chamber. Enclosed. Below water level. Inspection limited. She wrote it down and underlined it, and then sat looking at it for a while before she understood why it had lodged itself in her mind, the way it had. And nobody had been inside it. In a structure that had been standing since 1871, in a building that 4 generations of Pruitts had worked and maintained and ultimately abandoned, there was a room that had not been opened in long enough that a county inspector had written off access entirely rather than force entry. A room built of the same stone as the rest of the mill, fitted with the same precision, sealed against the creek water that rose and fell around it for 150 years. She told herself she was being dramatic. She told herself that an old sealed room in an old mill was nothing more than evidence of old water damage and old engineering and the practical decision of people who had learned not to go poking around in places that might fall on them. She told herself this very firmly, and made a cup of coffee, and looked out the window of the motel room at the parking lot and the highway beyond it, and the ordinary gray Saturday morning that contained nothing mysterious at all. Then she drove back to the mill. Margot was at her grandmother's for the day, an arrangement that had taken 3 phone calls and the promise of $20 that Elena did not currently have but would find. Elena drove alone. She parked on the gravel margin beside the building and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the creek. She had brought a flashlight and a pry bar from the hardware store, along with a pair of rubber boots because Rosalind had said something about water intrusion. She had also brought the composition notebook and a pen because she had discovered that writing things down was a way of making them real enough to approach without flinching. The interior of the mill was the same as she had left it. She moved through it differently now, with more attention, looking at the seams where the walls met the floor, the places where the original construction showed through the later repairs, the bones of the thing beneath the century and a half of use. She found the door to the Waterwheel chamber on the west wall of the lower level, almost directly opposite the front door. It was a low door, barely 5 feet high, set into the stone wall without a frame, just a wooden panel fitted into the opening and secured with a bar latch that had rusted solid. She worked on the latch for 20 minutes with the pry bar. It gave all at once with a sound like a gunshot in the confined space, and she stepped back without meaning to, her heart in her throat, and then felt slightly foolish and stepped forward again. The door swung inward. The smell that came out was water and stone and iron and something else, something she could not immediately name, a heaviness that was not mold and not rot, but was the smell of a space that had been sealed from the world for a very long time. She switched on the flashlight and pointed it through the doorway. The chamber was not large, maybe 12 feet across, maybe 15 deep. The ceiling was low, arched, formed of the same stone as the exterior walls, but shaped differently, with an intention that was almost architectural in its precision. The floor was wet in patches, where water had found its way through the foundation stones over the years, but not flooded, not collapsed. The wheel mechanism was here, or its lower half, the great iron axle running through the wall to the outside wheel, its mounting bracket still intact, a frozen monument to the moment in 1991 when everything had stopped. Rust had done its work on the iron, but had not defeated it. The stone had held. She stepped inside. The floor was uneven, the stone worn in certain places and rough in others. Her boots kept her dry. She moved the flashlight slowly around the space, not looking for anything in particular, simply looking, the way you looked at something you had waited to see. The south wall was different. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The stonework on the south wall was the same age as everything else, the same rough-cut local limestone that the Pruitts had used to build the entire structure. But there was a seam in it, a deliberate seam, not a crack from settling, not a fracture from pressure, but a joint, the kind that a mason made intentionally, a line that described the outline of a section of wall that could, in theory, be separated from the rest. She pressed her hand against it. The stone was cool and slightly damp and did not move. She ran her finger along the seam. It was tight, fitted with precision, the mortar along its edges different in color from the surrounding mortar. Older. Much older, potentially, or simply mixed differently, with different materials. She stood back and looked at the entire south wall with the flashlight and understood that what she was looking at was not one wall, but two. An outer wall, the stone she could touch, and behind it, if the seam was any indication, something else. A cavity, a recess, a secondary space built into the wall itself or behind it. In the waterwheel chamber of a gristmill that nobody had properly entered in decades. She stood in the damp and the dark and breathed and thought about the county inspector who had looked at this door and decided not to force it. She thought about the Pruitt family, 4 generations of them, working this mill and eventually walking away. She thought about the $9 she had paid for this piece of land, and the $11 remaining in her account, and Margot asking about her grandmother's car. She thought about the seam in the wall. Then she went home, because she needed a different tool and better light, and at least one other person, and because she had learned, in 31 years of being someone who made impulsive decisions and then had to live with them, that the difference between an impulsive decision and a catastrophic one was often just whether you slept on it first. She slept on it. She did not sleep well, but she slept on it. Rosalind came with her the second time. Elena had told her about the chamber and the seam, and Rosalind had said, "You're not suggesting there's something behind that wall," and Elena had said, "I'm not suggesting anything. I just want another set of eyes." And Rosalind had said, "This is how people in movies get killed, Elena." And Elena had said, "This is a grist mill in a county with 1,700 people. Not a movie," and Rosalind had come. They brought better flashlights, a hammer and cold chisel. Rosalind's brother worked construction and had explained to Rosalind over the phone what to look for in old stone wall construction, which was more than either of them had known before the call. They entered the chamber together. Rosalind stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the space, and then walked slowly to the south wall and crouched in front of the seam and was quiet for a long time. "That's not a crack," she said. "No," Elena said. "That's a door. Or it used to be. That's what I thought." Rosalind ran her hands along the seam in both directions. "Look at this. The mortar here is different from the mortar everywhere else in this room. Someone came in here and filled this in. At some point after the original construction, and someone came in, opened this, did whatever they were doing, and then sealed it back up." She looked up at Elena. "When was this mill built?" 1871. "And when do you think the seal is from?" Elena shook her head. "I don't know. Could be any time between then and now." They worked on the seam for 2 hours. The chisel bit into the mortar slowly. The stone was dense, and the work was difficult, and neither of them was a mason. What they were was determined, and eventually determination accomplished what technique could not quite manage, and a section of the south wall, approximately 18 inches wide and 4 feet tall, separated from the rest with a grinding sound that neither of them would forget. Behind it was darkness. They stood in the chamber with their flashlights pointed at the opening, and the darkness absorbed the light and gave nothing back immediately, the way darkness in enclosed spaces always did, pulling illumination inward rather than reflecting it. Elena stepped forward and pushed her flashlight through the opening and angled it downward. The space beyond the wall was deeper than the chamber itself. It dropped. Not a sheer drop, but a gradual slope. Stone steps cut into the floor, descending maybe 8 feet before leveling out into another surface. She could see the floor at the bottom, stone like the rest, and on it, she could see shapes. Shapes that did not belong to stone or iron or the ordinary contents of a mill. She looked at Rosalind. Rosalind looked at her. "I'm going down," Elena said. "I know," Rosalind said. "No, I'm coming too." The steps were solid. The space at the bottom was a room, true and enclosed, with a ceiling just high enough to stand in without stooping, and walls that had been built with the same care as the chamber above. It was dry down here, the dampness of the upper level absent, the air still and old and dense, with the smell of something Elena's mind classified instinctively as valuable before she had consciously identified what she was seeing. The room held shelves, wooden shelves, old and darkened, but intact, attached to the stone walls with iron brackets, and on the shelves, arranged with a care that spoke of deliberateness and intention, and someone who had understood exactly what they were placing here and why, were containers. Metal boxes, maybe 40 of them. Some made of tin, some of heavier iron, and some sealed with wax around their lids. They had been placed with space between them, not stacked or crammed but arranged, each one set with its own specific deliberateness. They ranged from the size of a shoebox to the size of a small suitcase. Elena picked up the nearest one. It was heavy, far heavier than she expected for its size. She set it on the floor and worked at the lid. The wax seal crumbled under her fingers, dry and ancient. The lid lifted. Inside, nested in material that had once been cloth and was now the ghost of cloth, translucent with age, she saw something catch the light. She reached in. She lifted out a stone the size of a large marble. It was not clear. It was not exactly colorless. It was the color of depth itself, the color of something that contained its own light rather than borrowing from outside. See, it had 8 flat faces that came to 2 opposed points, the natural geometry of something formed over millions of years of pressure and time, uncut, unpolished, exactly as it had come from the earth. She held it in her palm for a long time without speaking. Rosalind said very quietly, "Elena, I see it. I know." The flashlight beam caught the facets and broke into fragments of cold fire, a dozen small lights scattered across the stone walls of the room. "There's 40 boxes," Rosalind said. Her voice had gone strange, steady on the surface and something else underneath. Elena set the stone back gently. She replaced it the same way she had found it, tucked into the ghost of cloth, treated with the exact care it deserved. Then she stood up and looked at the shelves and the boxes and the room that nobody had opened in long enough, that the wax seal had gone to powder. She thought about $9. She thought about Margot and the field trip. She thought about her mother's apartment and the condemned building and the vending machines on every floor of the motel. She thought about the Pruitt family, 4 generations of them, who had owned this mill for 150 years and apparently had never opened this room, or who had opened it and sealed it deliberately, or who had known it was here and never told anyone, or who had forgotten entirely, the knowledge dying with whoever last came down these steps. She thought about all of that, and standing in a sealed room beneath a waterwheel chamber in a grist mill she had purchased for $9 on a cold Tuesday in March, holding a flashlight in one hand and the lid of a metal box in the other. And then she put the lid back on the box and sat down on the bottom step and pressed her hands against her knees to keep them steady and told herself to breathe. She breathed. The room waited. The stones held. The creek moved overhead through its ancient channel, the same water it had always been, going where it had always gone, carrying nothing away. She breathed. The first thing she said, when she could say anything at all, was, "We need a lawyer." The second thing she said was, "We need to know what those are." The third thing she said was nothing, because Rosalind had pulled her into a hug in the low-ceilinged room, and they were both shaking slightly, and neither of them wanted to be the first to say what they were both thinking, which was that something enormous had just happened, and neither of them was entirely sure yet which direction enormous was going to fall. They went back up the steps carefully. They closed the opening as best they could, repositioning the stone section and wedging it in place without the mortar to hold it. They went back through the chamber and out through the low door into the main floor of the mill, and then out through the front door into the late afternoon light, which was pale and thin and impossibly ordinary. For Elena stood in the gravel and looked at the water wheel and at the creek and at the building that had been built in 1871 and had stood through everything that 150 years contained, all the seasons and the floods and the changing of the world around it, and inside which below the mechanism of the wheel, in a room sealed with wax and stone and time, there were 40 metal boxes. She got in her car. She drove to the motel. She called her sister. Darlene picked up on the second ring and said what, because that was how Darlene answered the phone when she knew it was Elena and suspected something had happened, which was most of the time. Why, Elena said, "You remember how you said I was out of my mind?" Darlene said, "Yes." Elena said, "I need you to help me figure out if I'm still out of my mind, or if something else is happening." There was a pause. "Elena," Darlene said, "what did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Elena said. "I just looked at a wall." What followed next was the part that nobody had prepared her for, which was the reality that finding something extraordinary did not immediately produce extraordinary results, but instead produced a very long and complicated series of ordinary steps, each of which had to be taken carefully, in order, without rushing, because the world had its processes, and its processes did not adjust themselves for the emotional state of a woman who had just found 40 metal boxes in a sealed room under an old mill. She found a lawyer first, a property attorney named Gerald Park, who practiced 2 counties over and who had, according to his website, experience in estate law, asset recovery, and historic property litigation, which seemed like the closest combination she was going to find on short notice. She told him about the property and the purchase and the room. She told him about the boxes. She did not yet tell him about the stone she had held in her palm, and he told her 3 things that she wrote down in the composition notebook. First, the contents of the mill, being found within the boundaries of the property, were almost certainly legally hers under the doctrine of found property, assuming no competing claim could be demonstrated by the Pruitt estate. So second, she should not remove or disturb the contents until the chain of title was fully established and any potential claims were investigated. Third, she should have the contents professionally assessed as soon as possible, because without knowing what was actually there, none of the rest of it could be properly addressed. She thanked him. She hung up. She added a call to the list of things that had cost her money she did not have. The assessment required a gemologist. Rosalind found one through the University Extension Office, a woman named Dr. Carla Osei, who did appraisal work, and who, when Elena called her and described the contents of one of the boxes without naming what she believed she was looking at, said, "You'll need to bring me a sample, or I'll need to come to the site. I don't make assessments, sight unseen, on materials I haven't seen." Elena said, "When can you come?" Dr. Osei came on a Friday. She was a small woman in her late 50s, with very precise hands, and glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck, and only put on when she needed them, which was often. She said nothing on the drive to the mill. She said nothing during the walk to the mill. She said nothing when Elena showed her the chamber door, and nothing when they descended the steps into the sealed room below. She stood in the room with her flashlight and looked at the shelves for a long time. Then she put on her glasses. She opened the nearest box. She lifted one of the stones. She turned it in her fingers with the care of someone handling something that did not belong to the moment they were in, something that predated them entirely and would outlast them completely. She held it up to the light. She opened a second box, a third. She moved along the shelf slowly, opening each container, lifting samples, turning them, replacing them. She did not speak. Her face gave nothing away. Elena and Rosalind stood near the steps and watched, and breathed, and did not speak either, because the room seemed to require silence, the way an operating theater required silence, not out of reverence, but out of necessity, the way that the wrong word at the wrong moment might disturb something irreplaceable. After 45 minutes, Dr. Osei closed the last box. She took off her glasses and let them hang on their chain. She turned to Elena. "How much do you know about rough diamond deposits in the eastern United States?" she said. For Elena said, "Nothing." Dr. Osei said. There were historically several known diamond-bearing formations in Virginia, the Carolinas, and into Georgia. Most of them were small, the yields modest enough that commercial mining was never viable. There are also, in the historical record, a number of instances of significant gem-quality stones being found by private individuals and never entering the public record. Before the Civil War, and in the decade or two following, there was considerable movement of valuable materials through private hands, often stored in exactly the kind of configurations you have here. She paused. This is not the first time I have seen something like this. I have never seen it at this scale. The room was very quiet. What scale? Elena said. Dr. Osei looked at the shelves. Gua, I cannot give you a final number without a proper assessment and certification process. What I can tell you is that rough diamond material of this quality, and in this quantity, is not a minor discovery. The stones I've examined range from what appear to be industrial quality material on the low end to gem quality stones that, once cut and certified, would command significant prices per carat. The larger stones in some of these boxes. She stopped. She put her glasses back on and looked at one of the boxes again, then took them off. You need a formal assessment. You need it done by a certified laboratory with full documentation. What I can tell you informally, standing here, is that you have something significant. How significant? Rosalind said. Dr. Osei looked at her for a moment. Significant enough, she said, that you need to be very careful about who you tell and when. She said it the way someone said something when the word significant was not quite large enough for what they meant, but no larger word was available that would not tip the whole situation into the territory of the unbelievable, and the unbelievable required management before it could be spoken aloud. Elena stood in the room that had been sealed for longer than anyone alive could have sealed it, and felt the floor under her feet, and the stone walls around her, and the weight of 40 metal boxes on wooden shelves, and the sound of the creek moving overhead through the mechanism that had been still for 30 years. And she thought about $9. She thought, I bought this for $9. And then, because she was Elena Voss, and she had been doing this for 31 years, for she opened the composition notebook and wrote down everything Dr. Osei had said, and drew a small sketch of the room from memory, and noted the date and the time and the exact words. Significant enough that you need to be very careful about who you tell and when. She closed the notebook. She looked at Rosalind. Rosalind looked at her. Okay, Elena said. The word was small and insufficient and completely inadequate to the moment. She said it again anyway. The drive back to the motel felt longer than it was. Elena kept both hands on the wheel and drove at exactly the speed limit, which was something she did not always do. But today felt like a day for precision. Rosalind sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window, and neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything there was to say was too large to begin with, and so they began with nothing instead, which is where most large conversations have to start. Eventually, Rosalind said, We have to tell someone. I know, Elena said. Not everyone, but someone official. The lawyer, maybe the county. I know. This is the kind of thing that has paperwork attached to it. Everything has paperwork attached to it. Rosalind turned from the window and looked at her. Elena, there are 40 boxes of rough diamonds under your mill. The word rough diamonds, in Rosalind's voice, spoken plainly in the front seat of the Civic on a county road at 4 in the afternoon with the heater running and a granola bar wrapper from Margot's Saturday visible in the footwell, was different from the word rough diamonds in Elena's head. In her head, it had been a kind of floating abstraction, a thing Dr. Osei had confirmed, but that had not fully landed. Spoken aloud by Rosalind, who did not speculate and did not embellish, and who had worked in the county assessor's office for 9 years, and had seen many things and described all of them in exactly the factual terms they deserved. The words landed. Elena felt them land. She kept her hands on the wheel. "I know," she said again. It seemed to be the only response available to her. She had said it 3 times now, and it was still the truest thing she could offer. She knew. She did not yet know what she knew, which was different. But the knowing itself she had. She thought about what Dr. Osei had said, not the part about the scale, which was the part her mind kept trying to calculate and failing. The other part. You need to be very careful about who you tell and when. That was a sentence with a meaning she understood completely, the kind of careful that Dr. Osei had said, with the weight of someone who had seen what happened when carefulness was skipped. The world had ways of rushing in on discoveries like this, legal ways and financial ways, and ways that wore other people's faces. She needed Gerald Park before she needed anyone else, and she needed to keep her mouth shut in the meantime, which was easier said than done when the thing you were keeping your mouth shut about was this particular thing. She dropped Rosalind at her apartment building and drove to pick up Margot from her mother's. Margot was in a good mood, full of a story about a show she had watched, and a cat that lived on her grandmother's 3rd floor, and something about a boy at school named Devin, who had apparently done something either very funny or very wrong, and Margot seemed to find both possibilities equally satisfying. Elena drove and listened, and made the appropriate sounds in the appropriate places, and at one point Margot said, "Mom, are you listening?" And Elena said, "Of course, Devin." And Margot said, "Devin's the name, Mom, not the thing he did." And Elena said, "Sorry, sweetheart. Tell me again." That night, after Margot was asleep in the bed they shared because the motel had only given them the one, Elena sat at the small desk by the window with the composition notebook and worked through what she knew and what she needed to do about what she knew. What she knew, there were 40 sealed containers in a room beneath the Waterwheel chamber of the Callow Creek Gristmill. Those containers held rough diamonds. Dr. Carla Osei, a certified gemologist with 30 years of professional experience, had examined a sampling of those stones and used the word significant twice and had told her to be careful. The property had been purchased legally. The chain of title was clear as far as she knew. The room had been sealed, and whatever was in it had been there for a very long time. What she needed to do? Speak to Gerald Park. Have a full professional assessment conducted under documented and controlled conditions. Establish the chain of ownership clearly and legally before anything else happened. And tell no one, absolutely no one, until those steps were complete. And she wrote all of this in the composition notebook and drew a line under it. Then she sat back and looked at the line. She thought about Margot asking about her grandmother's car. She thought about the pile of bills arranged by overdue date. She thought about the field trip, the granola bars, the motel with its weekly rates and its vending machines. She thought about her own mother's 2-bedroom apartment that had been condemned and uncondemned and was being held together by the particular kind of willpower that women developed when the alternative was to stop. She thought about a sealed room and 40 boxes, and the way that one uncut stone, held in her palm in the light of a flashlight, had scattered fire across the walls of a space that had been dark for longer than she had been alive. She closed the notebook. She sat for a while longer in the dark of the motel room, listening to Margot breathe. Then she went to sleep. Gerald Park's office was in Renner, which was 2 counties over, and a 40-minute drive on roads that were not particularly interested in efficiency. Elena made the drive on a Monday morning, leaving Margot at school and arriving 10 minutes early, which she spent in the parking lot going over the notes she had prepared. She had brought everything: the deed, the auction receipt, the photographs she had taken in the chamber, including several of the sealed door and the seam and the room below. Dr. Osei's informal written summary, which Dr. Osei had produced without being asked, a single paragraph describing the material examined and her preliminary assessment of its nature. The composition notebook. That Gerald Park was a man in his early 60s, with reading glasses and a calm that came not from indifference, but from having seen many complicated situations and learned that most of them had solutions if you were patient enough to find them. He listened to everything. He looked at the photographs. He read Dr. Osei's summary twice. He asked 3 questions. Is the property currently secured against unauthorized access? Elena said she had padlocked the front door and wedged the chamber opening as best she could. Has anyone else entered the lower room? She said only herself and Rosalind and Dr. Osei during the assessment. Has anyone photographed or documented the contents in detail? She said no, only what she had sent him. He leaned back. All right, here's where we are. Under Virginia property law, objects found within the boundaries of real property you legally own are generally considered your property, provided there is no demonstrated competing claim. The Pruitt estate is the entity most likely to assert such a claim, given the historical ownership. However, given that the estate allowed the property to go to tax delinquency and did not contest the auction, their position is weak. They would have to demonstrate either that they were unaware of the contents, which is hard to prove, or that the contents were deliberately excluded from the sale, which is harder still without documentation. He paused. What I want you to do, he said, is nothing. Nothing public. Nothing that creates a record outside this office. I'm going to research the Pruitt estate's current status, confirm the auction proceedings, and consult with a colleague who specializes in found property at this scale. Meanwhile, you need to commission a full professional assessment of the contents, done properly, with chain of custody documentation from the moment the containers are opened. That assessment becomes the foundation of everything else. Elena said, How much is this going to cost? He looked at her for a moment. Let's discuss that after we know what we're working with. I have some flexibility on retainer terms for cases of this nature. She drove home with the feeling that she had done the first right thing, which was a feeling she recognized and valued because it was different from the feeling of having done a bold thing or a brave thing or a dramatic thing. It was quieter than all of those. It was the feeling of having moved correctly in a situation that required correctness above everything else. She picked up Margot from school. Margot said, Can we go to the mill this weekend? Elena said, Sure, sweetheart. Margot said, Can we bring fishing stuff? Elena said, We'll see about that. Margot said, Devin says there's definitely fish in creeks that run fast in spring. Elena said, Devin may be right. She drove toward the motel. The sky was doing something complicated with the light. The late afternoon breaking the clouds into colors that had no specific names. The kind of sky that made you look up even when you were tired and behind on rent, and carrying a secret the size of something you still didn't have the full vocabulary for. She looked up. Then she looked back at the road, because she was driving, and because the road was where she was going, and because whatever else was true, the road was where she was. The assessment took 11 days. Not because Dr. Osei was slow. She was not slow. She was, as Elena learned over the course of those 11 days, one of the most methodical people she had ever encountered. A woman who moved through her work with the particular precision of someone who understood that speed and accuracy were not always compatible and had long ago chosen accuracy. The 11 days were a function of the work itself, which required not only the examination of each stone in each of the 40 containers, but the documentation of every stone individually, its weight, its clarity, its color grade in the rough, its estimated yield after cutting, or its provenance as far as could be determined by composition and crystal structure. It was not a task that rushed. Elena knew the 11 days were happening because Gerald Park told her they were happening. She was not present for the assessment. Gerald had arranged for a secure transport company to move the containers from the mill to a certified examination facility in Richmond, a process that had required 3 days of its own and a level of logistical coordination that Elena had no prior experience with and had found simultaneously impressive and surreal. She had stood in the Waterwheel chamber and watched men in professional gear carry 40 metal boxes up the stone steps and through the mill and into a vehicle that looked nothing like a normal delivery truck and had felt something she could not quite name, a loosening in the chest that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The boxes were no longer hers to worry about in the physical sense. They were being handled. The handling was happening. She went back to the motel and waited. Waiting was not something Elena was naturally skilled at. She had built her life, such as it was, on motion, on the next thing and the thing after that, on making calls and filling out forms and finding the angle that other people had missed and pursuing it without stopping, because stopping was when the fear caught up. The 11 days of waiting were therefore 11 days of a particular discipline she had not previously practiced, which was the discipline of doing everything she could do, and then sitting still while the rest was done by people who were better positioned to do it. She worked. She picked up extra shifts at the grocery where she had been working part-time since December. She drove Margot to school and picked her up and helped with homework and made dinner and did all the things that were the actual content of her life, as opposed to the extraordinary thing happening at its edge. She spoke to Gerald Park every other day. She spoke to Rosalind once, briefly, and they both understood without discussing it that the subject of the mill was not a phone conversation subject. She told no one else. She almost told her mother twice. Once on a Tuesday when her mother called to say the building super had finally responded to the maintenance request, which had turned out to be worse news than no response, because the response was that the repair would cost money the building didn't have, and the tenant would need to manage in the meantime. Elena listened to this and thought about 40 metal boxes in a facility in Richmond and said, "I know, Mama, I know. It's going to be okay." And her mother said, "You always say that." And Elena said, "I know." And her mother said, "Is it though?" And Elena said, "Yes. Actually, I think it really is." And there was a silence on the line that her mother filled by saying, "You sound different." And Elena said, "I'm just tired." And her mother said, "No, different." And Elena changed the subject. The second time she almost told her was on a Thursday when Margot came home from school and announced that Devin had said the creek at the mill probably had catfish in it because Devin's uncle had caught catfish in creeks that ran over limestone, and Elena's mill was on limestone bedrock. Devin had looked it up, and could they maybe buy a fishing rod? Elena had looked at her daughter, who was 7 years old, and had her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and a friend named Devin, who apparently researched creek geology for fun, and had felt the 11 days of waiting compress into a single moment of crystalline clarity. She bought a fishing rod. It was $11 at the sporting goods resale shop 2 blocks from the motel, used, missing the original grip tape, but structurally sound. She told herself it was an investment. On the morning of the 12th day, Gerald Park called. He called at 8:47, which was earlier than he usually called, and Elena was still in the process of getting Margot ready for school, which meant she took the call, standing in the bathroom doorway watching Margot brush her teeth while she listened. "The assessment is complete," Gerald said. Elena said, "Okay. Dr. Osei has submitted her formal report to me. I've reviewed it. I'd like to go over it with you in person rather than on the phone. Can you tell me the number?" There was a pause. Gerald was not a man who paused often. He paused now. "I'd really prefer to do this in person," he said. "Gerald." Another pause. Shorter. "The preliminary valuation of the rough material," he said carefully, "based on estimated yield, current market rates for gem-quality stones of this origin and type, and the assessed weight and clarity distribution across the collection, is in the range of $290 to $330 million. The bathroom was very small. The walls were close. Margot was still brushing her teeth, making a face at herself in the mirror, the way she did when she thought no one was watching. The fluorescent light above the sink hummed at its usual frequency. Elena said, "Say that again." He said it again. She stood very still. She was aware of Margot and the toothbrush and the fluorescent light and the sound of the heating unit kicking on in the room behind her and the feeling of the phone in her hand and all of these ordinary things happening in their ordinary way, while Gerald Park's voice said the number a second time, and the number remained what it had been the first time. "The assessment uses current rough diamond market pricing," he continued. "This is not a retail figure. The retail figure, once stones are cut, certified, and sold through appropriate channels, would be substantially higher. The $290 to $330 million represents conservative wholesale valuation of the raw material." "Conservative," Elena said. Dr. Osei's word. She's inclined to be conservative. Margot rinsed and spat and looked at her mother in the mirror. "Mom, you okay?" Elena put her hand over the phone. "Yes, baby, almost done." Into the phone she said, "I'll be there at 10. She was there at 9:40. She sat in the parking lot for the remaining 20 minutes and looked at the dashboard and breathed. She had done a version of this in the parking lot of Gerald's office before. The repetition was almost comforting. She was a person who sat in parking lots and breathed before difficult conversations. This was a known fact about herself. She found it reassuring. Inside, Gerald spread the assessment report on the conference table. It was 41 pages. Elena had not expected 41 pages, but understood immediately why it was 41 pages, each stone cataloged individually, each container documented. The methodology explained in language that was precise enough to hold up under any future scrutiny. Dr. Osei had not simply looked at the stones. She had built a case for what they were and what they were worth, the kind of case that did not invite challenge. They went through it together. Gerald walked her through the methodology. He explained the range and why it was a range rather than a single number. He explained the distinction between rough valuation and retail valuation, and what factors would affect the final realized amount when and if the material entered the market. He was careful and thorough, and at no point during the conversation did he suggest she should feel any particular way about any of it, which she appreciated because she was not entirely sure how she felt and did not want to be directed. When she read certain sections herself, slowly, the descriptions of individual stones that Dr. Osei had flagged as exceptional. There were 11 of them. Stones that the report described as gem-quality rough of exceptional size and clarity, the kind of material that, cut by a skilled craftsman, would yield stones of a grade that appeared at major auction houses rather than jewelry store cases. The largest had been weighed at 412 carats in the rough. The assessment estimated its post-cut yield at somewhere between 100 and 140 carats, depending on the cutting approach, and its value at between $40 and $60 million for a single stone. Elena looked at that line for a long time. Then she turned the page. "What happens now?" she said. Gerald had been expecting this question. He had a list. He went through it the way he went through everything, methodically, in order. There were legal steps. The Pruitt estate had to be formally notified and given the opportunity to assert a claim, which was a process with a defined timeline. The county might have an interest given the historic nature of the property and the unusual circumstances of the discovery, which would need to be navigated. Federal regulations around the movement and sale of significant gemological discoveries had to be reviewed. There were tax implications that would require a specialist. There were insurance implications that were immediate and could not wait. The Pruitts, Elena said. What's the realistic chance they make a claim? Non-trivial. The estate is administered by the remaining family, primarily one surviving member who is elderly and has been largely uninvolved in the estate's affairs. However, once word of a discovery of this scale reaches them, their legal representation will become considerably more active. He paused. I want you to be prepared for a period of challenge. It will likely not be brief. How not brief? Months, possibly longer. These things find their own pace. Elena nodded. She had expected this. She had not exactly expected $300 million, but she had expected that whatever was in those boxes was not going to simply transfer into her name and her account without someone else deciding they had a claim to it. That was the nature of valuable things. The world organized itself around them in complicated ways. Can they win? She said, and Gerald considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. The law is on your side. You purchased the property legally. The contents were within the property boundaries, and there is no documentation we have found that excludes the contents from the sale. Their strongest argument would be that the estate was unaware of the contents and therefore could not have intended to include them. That argument has limits. He looked at her steadily. You have a strong position, Elena, and I want you to know that. She drove home with the 41-page report in a manila envelope on the passenger seat and the number in her head and the peculiar sensation of being exactly the same person she had been that morning, while simultaneously being someone who existed in an entirely different relationship to the future than she had existed in 12 days ago. She picked up Margot from school. Margot said, Devin says catfish can grow really big in limestone creeks. Elena said, Devin sounds like he's done his research. Margot said, Devin's dad has a boat. Elena said, maybe Devin's dad can give us some tips. That evening, after Margot was asleep, she called Darlene. She told her everything, the whole sequence of it, from the auction to the chamber to the sealed room to doctor. I.O.S.A. to Gerald Park to the 41-page report to the number. She told it slowly and in order, because Darlene deserved the full story, and because Elena had been holding it for 11 days, and the telling of it was something she needed to do in the same way she sometimes needed to set something heavy down, not because she couldn't carry it anymore, but because her arms wanted to remember what it felt like to be empty. Darlene was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then Darlene said, $300 million. That's the range, the high end of the range. Elena, $300 million. Yes. For $9. For $9. Another silence. Darlene made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else that didn't have a clean name. I said you were out of your mind, she said. You did. I said it in a bad way. I know. Elena, Darlene said, and her voice had changed, gone softer in a way that Darlene's voice rarely went, because Darlene was the practical one, the one who measured before she cut, the one who had always been the anchor in the family's tendency to drift, and softness was a register she didn't use often because she saved it for when it was actually needed. Are you okay? Elena thought about the question honestly, which took a moment. I don't know yet, she said. I think so. I think I need to wait until more of it is settled before I know for sure. Do you need anything? Not right now. I just needed to tell you. Okay, Darlene said. Okay, I'm here. I know. When it's over, Darlene said. When all the legal stuff is done, and it's real, and you can actually say it out loud without it still feeling like a dream, will you take me to see it? The room? Elena thought about the room, the stone steps, the shelves, The boxes arranged with such care by hands that had known something about what they were placing and where. Hands that had understood that the value of the thing required the protection of the place. "Yes," she said, "I'll take you." The news moved the way news moved in small communities, which was not in a straight line, and not all at once, but in spirals, outward from a center, reaching different people at different distances at different times, distorted at each remove. A game of telephone played over a geography of front porches and grocery store aisles and the parking lots of churches. Elena had not told anyone she wasn't required to tell. Gerald Park's office was bound by confidentiality. Dr. Osei operated under professional discretion. Rosalind understood without being asked. Darlene lived 2 states away. And yet, the county assessor's office had received a notification of the professional examination as part of the legal process Gerald had initiated. The Secure Transport Company had filed the required paperwork with the county. A notation had appeared in the Public Record Index, brief and technical, referencing a significant gemological discovery on Parcel 47 of the Hallows Bend foreclosure record. It was not a notification designed to attract attention. It was the kind of entry that required knowing where to look and having a reason to look there. Someone had a reason. Elena did not know exactly when it began to spread. She became aware of it the way you became aware of weather that had been building while you were indoors, emerging to find the sky already changed. The first signal was a call from a number she didn't recognize, a man who introduced himself as a journalist from a regional paper, asking whether she could confirm reports of a significant find on her Callow Creek property. She said no comment and hung up and called Gerald. Gerald said, "It was going to happen. We'll manage it." 2 days later, there was a car parked on the road near the mill when she drove by. She had been stopping at the property regularly, not to go inside, which Gerald had asked her not to do while the legal process was active, but to look at it, to maintain her connection to it through proximity. The car had a camera on the passenger seat visible through the window. She drove past without stopping. The regional paper ran a story 4 days after that. It was careful in its language because the paper did not yet have confirmed numbers, only the notation from the public record and the speculation that notation had produced. The headline said, "Foreclosed mill property may contain significant hidden discovery." The story described the auction, the $9 purchase price, the assessment that had been conducted at a facility in Richmond. It didn't have the number. It had the shape of the number, the suggestion of it, the fact of a professional examination that had been deemed necessary and serious. And that was enough. The shape of the number was enough to start things moving. Elena found out about the story from Margot, which was not how she had planned to explain any of it to her daughter, but was, she later reflected, probably the best introduction possible, because Margot's first response to learning that her mother might have found something important in the mill was, "Does that mean we can get Devon's dad's boat to help with the catfish?" Elena said they would see. Margot seemed satisfied with this and went back to her homework. Elena sat at the small desk in the motel room and thought about how to explain to a 7-year-old that the thing that was happening was real, but that real took time, and that time required patience, and that patience was not the same as nothing happening. It was just nothing happening at a speed that was visible, and the invisible speed was the one that mattered most right now. So she decided to explain it approximately the way she had explained most large things to Margot over the past 2 years, which was honestly and simply, and without either minimizing or amplifying, because children had calibrated sensors for both and responded poorly to each. She said, "You know the mill we bought?" Margot said, "Yes. We found something inside it, something that might be worth a lot of money." Margot said, "How much money?" Elena said, "We don't know exactly yet. A lot." Margot said, More than the field trip money? Elena said, "Yes, baby. More than the field trip money." Margot looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she had that meant she was processing something that required reordering her existing understanding of the situation. Then she said, "Is that why there was a car outside the mill yesterday when we drove by?" Elena said, "Yes, I think so." Margot said, "Devin says famous people get followed around by cameras." Elena said, "We're not famous." Margot said, "Not yet," with a confidence that Elena found both alarming and, in spite of everything, a little bit wonderful. The phone calls escalated. Elena stopped answering numbers she didn't recognize. Gerald's office became a buffer, fielding the inquiries that were coming in from parties whose interest was not journalistic, but financial. Investors, collectors, a representative from a major auction house who had apparently read the regional paper story and done some arithmetic, a gemologist from a university department who was interested in the provenance of the discovery for academic purposes and would very much like access to the assessment records. 2 lawyers representing themselves as advocates for historic mineral rights, whose connection to the situation was not immediately clear and who Gerald dispatched with efficient brevity. And then, the Pruitt estate. The letter arrived at Gerald's office on a Friday afternoon, formal and dense, from a law firm in Richmond that Elena had not heard of, but that Gerald clearly had, given the particular quality of his silence when he called to tell her about it. The estate was asserting a claim. The grounds were what Gerald had predicted. The estate maintained that the contents of the sealed chamber had never been part of the property, as understood at the time of the auction. That the existence of the chamber was unknown to the estate's representatives, and that therefore the objects within it could not be considered to have been included in the sale of the land. Elena listened to this and said, "Is that true? That they didn't know?" Gerald said, "That is what they are asserting." "But is it true?" A pause. "The Pruitt family owned that mill for 150 years, Elena. The sealed room has been there, as far as we can determine from the construction methods and the materials used to seal it, for somewhere between 70 and 100 years. Whether any living member of the family knew about it is something we will explore during discovery." "Discovery," she said. "Yes. This is going to court." She had known it was going to court. She had known it from the moment Gerald said the word challenge weeks ago, had built it into her understanding of how this was going to unfold. Knowing it and hearing the word discovery spoken in the particular tone Gerald used when something had moved from likely to certain were 2 different things, and the second one sat differently in her chest. "Okay," she said. "I want you to understand something," Gerald said. "Their claim is not without legal merit. It's an argument that has been made in similar cases, with mixed results. But I want you also to understand that your position is strong. The law of found property, the circumstances of the sale, the fact that the contents were physically within the boundaries of the parcel as sold, these are substantial arguments in your favor. This is winnable." "How long?" she said. "A year, perhaps. Possibly less if they assess their position and decide negotiation serves them better." A year. Elena looked at the motel room wall, the crack in the paint above the window that she had been looking at for 4 months, the weekly rate sign visible through the curtain gap. A year. "All right," she said. She hung up and sat for a while. Then she got up and made dinner, because it was dinner time, and Margot would be hungry, and the world continued on its ordinary schedule regardless of what was happening at its edges. And there was something she had come to understand, important about letting it do that. She was about not allowing the extraordinary to swallow the ordinary entirely, because the ordinary was where Margot's homework got done, and the granola bars got eaten, and the 7-year-old with the calibrated sensors got the mother she needed rather than the mother who had been consumed by the magnitude of what was happening in a sealed room in a mill beside a creek 45 minutes away. She made pasta. She grated the last of the cheese. She called Margot to the table. Margot sat down and looked at the bowl and said, "Mom, Devin says his dad would teach me to fish if you said it was okay." Elena said, "Tell Devin's dad we'd appreciate that." Margot said, "Really?" Elena said, "Really?" Margot's face did the thing it did when something she had not fully expected to work actually worked. A brief flash of pure, uncomplicated pleasure before the composure that even 7-year-olds had some version of reasserted itself. Elena watched it and felt something in herself settle in a way that had nothing to do with the assessment report or the Pruitt estate or the letter from the law firm in Richmond. She ate her pasta. The legal process was not quick, and it was not quiet, but it had a shape, and the shape was something Elena could understand and work within. Gerald filed the response to the Pruitt claim on a Tuesday, a document that was considerably longer than the letter that had prompted it, and that Elena read twice, finding it both dense and satisfying in the way that things built with care to withstand scrutiny were satisfying. They filed for discovery simultaneously, and requesting all records the Pruitt estate possessed related to the history of the property, any documentation of the mill's construction or modification, and any communications regarding the interior of the Waterwheel chamber or any sealed spaces within the structure. The estate's lawyers pushed back on the discovery request. This was expected. Gerald pushed back on the pushback. This produced a motion. The motion produced a hearing. The hearing produced a ruling that the discovery request was largely valid and that the estate was required to produce the relevant documents within 30 days. Elena attended the hearing. She sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Gerald argue with the quiet efficiency she had come to recognize as his mode of operating under pressure. No theatrics, no raised voice, to just the steady application of logic and precedent to the specific facts of the situation. The judge, a woman in her late 50s, who seemed entirely unimpressed by anyone in the room, asked several sharp questions and then ruled. Elena walked out into the courthouse parking lot and stood in the spring air and thought about the parking lot of the auction house on a cold Tuesday in March, where she had stood with $11 in her checking account and her hand raised. She thought, "I am still that person." She thought, "I am still exactly that person, and that person is standing in a different parking lot now, and the ground under her feet is the same ground, and she made it here by doing the next right thing each time there was a next right thing to do." She got in the Civic. She drove to pick up Margot. Margot said, "Devin's dad said Saturday is good for fishing." Elena said, "Saturday works." Margot said, "He says we might catch catfish." Elena said, "Devin's dad sounds like he knows what he's talking about." She drove toward the motel, and then, on an impulse she did not resist, turned onto the county road instead, and drove the 45 minutes to Callow Creek, and parked on the gravel margin, and got out, and stood beside her daughter in the late afternoon light, and looked at the mill. The wheel was motionless. The creek ran beneath it. The stone walls held the light the way old stone did, absorbing it rather than reflecting it, becoming part of it. Margot put her hand in Elena's. Elena held it. The building stood where it had stood since 1871. Inside it, in a chamber beside the frozen wheel, behind a door that had been forced open by 2 women with a pry bar and several hours of determination, were stone steps that led down to a room that had held its secret through every season of every decade, of every generation, that had walked away from this place without knowing what they were leaving behind. Elena looked at it and thought, "I knew. Not the diamonds, not the boxes, not the number that Dr. Ossie had produced after 11 days of careful work. Not the Pruitt estate or the law firm in Richmond or the journalist in the regional paper. She had not known any of that. But she had stood in the parking lot of the county auction house on a cold Tuesday in March and looked at a listing for an abandoned gristmill and felt something she could not name and raised her hand anyway. She had driven 45 minutes on an unpaved road with her daughter and a granola bar wrapper in the footwell and stood in the doorway of this building and felt the thing settle in her chest that was quieter than hope and steadier than certainty. She had known something. "Mom," Margot said. "Yes. Do you think there are fish down there right now?" Elena looked at the creek, brown and quick in the spring flow, moving under the wheel with the patience of something that had been moving since before anyone had thought to build anything beside it. "I think there probably are," she said. Margot squeezed her hand. They stood there a while longer in the light. Then they drove home, because it was almost dinner time, and the world continued on its schedule, and there was pasta to make. The discovery request produced documents that Gerald reviewed first before sending Elena a summary, a professional courtesy she appreciated because the summary was difficult enough, and she was not sure the documents themselves would have been easier. The Pruitt family records went back 3 generations in the file, a history assembled from deeds, letters, mill ledgers, and a set of personal papers that had apparently been stored in a trunk in the family home for decades before being formally incorporated into the estate records when the last Pruitt of the primary line died 7 years earlier. The relevant documents were not labeled. They were not marked in any way that said, "Here is the thing you are looking for." They were embedded in the ordinary accumulation of a family's paper life, untucked between a receipt for grain equipment repair and a letter about a property boundary dispute from 1963. Gerald had found them because he was thorough, and because he had been looking for exactly the kind of thing they turned out to be. The first was a letter, handwritten, dated 1952, from a man named Absalom Pruitt to his son Clarence. It described, in the indirect language that people used when writing about things they did not want to put too plainly on paper, a portion of the mill's lower structure that contained material of significant value placed there by Absalom's own father, Jonas Pruitt, sometime in the late 1800s. The letter did not specify what the material was. It said only that it was the kind of thing that should be left where it was until a time came when leaving it there was no longer the wisest course. It said that Clarence would know when that time came. It said that until then, the room was to remain sealed and the knowledge of it kept within the family. The second document was a memorandum, also handwritten, in a different hand, dated 1971. This one was from Clarence to his own son, Robert. It confirmed that the room remained sealed and the material undisturbed. It described the location of the sealed entrance and how to access it. It said, "Do not open this unless the family faces a crisis that cannot be met any other way." There was no third document. Robert Pruitt had died in 2003. His estate had passed to a nephew who had managed it at a distance, paying the taxes when he could and eventually stopping, allowing the property to drift into the 11 years of delinquency that had brought it to the auction in March. Whether Robert had told the nephew about the room was not in the documents. Whether the nephew had known and chosen to let the mill go to auction anyway was a question whose answer Elena found herself thinking about in the quiet moments of the days that followed, turning it over. The way you turned over a stone to see what was underneath. Gerald presented the documents to the court, along with his argument that they conclusively demonstrated the Pruitt family's long-standing awareness of the room and its contents, which directly undermined the estate's claim that the chamber had been unknown to them. The estate's lawyers countered that the knowledge had died with Robert, and that the current estate representative could not be held responsible for information he had never received. The judge listened to both arguments, while she took the matter under advisement. Elena sat in the second row and listened to all of it, and thought about Jonas Pruitt, who had lived in the years after the Civil War and had built a room under his mill and filled it with rough diamonds and sealed it with stone and mortar, and told his son, who had told his son, who had told his son, who had died and taken the knowledge most of the way with him, leaving behind only those 2 pieces of paper that had waited in a trunk for 7 years to be found. She thought about what Jonas Pruitt must have known to have had those stones, what connections he must have had, what networks of movement and exchange had brought raw diamond material out of the earth and into the sealed room of a gristmill in rural Virginia. The documents did not say. The stones themselves did not say exactly, though Dr. Osei had noted in her report that the composition was consistent with material from certain historical sources in the southeastern United States, and that the apparent age of the wax seals was consistent with a late 19th century, dating for when the room had last been accessed. Jonas Pruitt had known what he had, and had understood that keeping it required hiding it, and he had hidden it so well that 150 years later, a woman with $11 in her checking account had bought the building for $9 at a foreclosure auction, without anyone in the Pruitt family understanding what they were selling. The judge ruled 6 weeks after the hearing. Elena was in Gerald's office when the ruling came in. Not because she had been told to be there, but because she had driven to Renner that morning with a feeling she could not precisely identify, and had sat in the parking lot and breathed, and then gone inside and asked Gerald's assistant if she could wait, and the assistant had said of course, and she had been in the waiting room with a cup of coffee. She wasn't drinking when Gerald opened his door and said her name with a quality in his voice she hadn't heard before. She went in. She sat down. He said, "The court has ruled in your favor." She sat very still. The judge found that the estate's claim was not supported by sufficient evidence that the chamber was unknown to the estate at the time of sale. The documents obtained during discovery were decisive. The court holds that the contents of the property as sold were legally included in the transfer of ownership and belong to you. Elena sat very still for another moment. Then she said, "Is it over?" Gerald said, "They can appeal. I think they will appeal, but the appeals process will be difficult for them given the quality of the ruling. Their lawyers may advise them to negotiate rather than appeal." What would negotiation look like? A settlement, a percentage of the eventual sale value in exchange for dropping any further claims. It's not unusual in cases of this nature. Elena thought about this. She thought about it with the careful attention she had been applying to everything in the past months, the same attention she had applied to the bills arranged by overdue date, the same attention that had made her look at a listing for an abandoned gristmill at 2 in the morning and understand something without being able to say exactly what. "What percentage would be reasonable?" she said. Gerald said, "That's a negotiation." "What percentage would be fair?" He considered. The Pruitt family maintained this property for 150 years. They paid taxes on it. They made repairs. The knowledge of the room's contents, while demonstrably present in the family at some point, had been largely lost by the time of the sale. An argument can be made that they contributed to the preservation of the building that housed the discovery, even inadvertently. He paused. 10% would be generous. 5% would be defensible. Elena was quiet for a moment. "Offer them 8, she said. Gerald looked at her. "Some 8%, she said, "of the final realized value after sale, not of the preliminary assessment. They get 8% of what it actually sells for, which is probably going to be more than the assessment anyway." "That's generous," he said. "They were going to lose everything," she said. "And an old man in 1952 wrote a letter to his son, telling him to take care of something. That's worth something." Gerald nodded slowly. "I'll make the call." She drove home. She called Darlene. Darlene said $300 million, 8% is $24 million, Elena. And Elena said, I know. And Darlene said you gave them $24 million. And Elena said it was theirs first, in a way. And Darlene was quiet for a moment, and then said, You are a strange and remarkable person. And Elena said, I know. And Darlene laughed. Like the real kind. The kind that meant something had resolved that had been held too long. The estate's lawyers called Gerald back within 48 hours. They accepted. The first person Elena told outside of the necessary circle was Rosalind. She drove to Rosalind's apartment on a Wednesday evening with a bottle of wine that cost more than $11 and sat at Rosalind's kitchen table and said, We won. And Rosalind put both hands over her face and kept them there for a long time, and then took them down and said, I knew it, which was not entirely true, but was the right thing to say. And they drank the wine and talked for 3 hours. And at some point, Rosalind said, Do you remember when I said this is how people in movies get killed? And Elena said yes, and Rosalind said I was wrong. And Elena said yes, you were. No, and Rosalind said in the best possible way, and Elena said absolutely. She told her mother on a Thursday. She sat across from her mother in the kitchen of the apartment that had been condemned twice, and held her mother's hands and explained what had happened in the order it had happened. From the auction listing at 2 in the morning, to the sealed room, to the assessment, to the court ruling. Her mother listened without speaking, which was not her mother's usual mode, but which seemed to be what the situation required from her. When Elena finished, her mother sat for a long moment, and then said, You always said it was going to be okay. Elena said, I know. Her mother said, I stopped believing you. Elena said, I know, Mama. Her mother said, I shouldn't have. Elena held her hands and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. It was just true, the way certain things were simply true, without requiring words to make them more so. She told Margot that evening. She used the same approach she had used before, honest and simple, and without amplification or minimization, adjusted only for the fact that some things had become clearer since the last conversation. She said, The mill and what we found in it are ours. She said, It means we don't have to worry about money the way we've been worrying. Margot said, Does that mean we can get our own place? Elena said, Yes. Margot said, With a real kitchen? Elena said, With a real kitchen. Margot thought about this for a moment with the focused seriousness she brought to important decisions. Then she said, Can Devin come over? Elena said, Devin can absolutely come over. Margot smiled, not the performed smile she sometimes produced for adults she was being polite to, but the undefended one, the one that came from somewhere underneath performance, from somewhere that was still 7 years old, and just wanted a kitchen and a friend to invite to it. Elena smiled back. Outside, the spring evening was doing something generous with the light. Through the motel window, the parking lot looked almost beautiful. The ordinary kind of beautiful that ordinary things achieved when you looked at them with the right attention, when you let them be what they were without requiring them to be more. She had bought a gristmill for $9. She had paid $9 for a building that had stood since 1871 beside a creek in a county with 1,700 people, and underneath its wheel there had been a room, and in the room there had been 40 boxes, and in the boxes there had been something that a man named Jonas Pruitt had placed there in the years after the Civil War and sealed with wax and stone, and told his son about, and his son had told his son, and the knowledge had passed from hand to hand across the generations, like a lamp being carried through a long, dark corridor until the last hand had let it go, and the lamp had gone out, and the room had remained sealed in the dark until the earth itself had shifted and sent her to stand in front of a listing on a county website at 2 in the morning. $312 million. That was the number the formal sale process would eventually produce, at the high end of the range Dr. Ose had suggested. And once the stones moved through certified channels, and the gem-quality material was cut and assessed, and the exceptional stones found their places in the rooms where exceptional stones went. That was the number. That was what the sealed room contained. But the number was not, Elena had come to understand, the thing. The thing was the parking lot on a cold Tuesday in March, and the $11 and the raised hand. The thing was Margot pressing her face against the car window and asking about fish. The thing was the sound of the creek, older than everything built beside it, going where it had always gone. She sat in the motel room that evening with Margot asleep beside her and the composition notebook open on the desk, and she wrote down the date and the outcome, the way she had written down everything else, in order, one with the care of someone who understood that the record mattered. Then she closed the notebook and turned off the light. The creek was 45 minutes away in the dark, moving under the wheel, carrying nothing away. She slept. The motel manager's name was Frank Delgado, and he had been running the property for 19 years with the kind of steady, unflappable temperament that came from witnessing every variety of human situation and finding that most of them eventually resolved themselves one way or another. He was not a man given to curiosity about his tenants' private affairs, which was one of the things Elena had appreciated about him. When she paid the weekly rate, she paid it, and he gave her the receipt, and that was the entirety of their transaction, conducted with mutual respect and no superfluous conversation. She stopped at the front desk on a Friday morning. Frank looked up. She said, "I'm going to be checking out next week." He nodded and started pulling up the account. She said, "I just wanted to say thank you for this place. It was what we needed when we needed it." Frank looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone recalibrating. Then he said, "You doing okay?" She said, "Yeah. Actually, yeah. We're doing okay." He nodded again. He printed the final receipt. He said, "Good luck to you." She said, "Thank you, Frank." She walked out into the parking lot with the morning light coming sideways across the asphalt and stood for a moment in it before getting in the car. The Civic's heater was still running slow, but the weather was warming now, and it mattered less. Next week, a real kitchen. Devon coming over. She drove to pick up Margot. Spring had arrived properly by then, not the tentative spring of early March when she had stood on the courthouse steps, but the committed kind, the kind that came with warmth in the air even on overcast days, and a particular quality of green in the fields beside the county roads that had not been there 2 months earlier. She noticed it on the drive. She noticed it the way she had been noticing things lately, with more attention than she had previously had available, as though some portion of her awareness that had been occupied entirely with survival logistics had been released back into the world to observe it. She thought this was probably what people meant when they talked about the weight of financial pressure. Not just the practical limitations, the bills, the weekly rate, the $11, but the cognitive weight of it, the way it narrowed the field of perception to the necessary and excluded the peripheral, and how, when the weight lifted even partially, you became aware of things you had been walking past without seeing, the green in the fields, the particular light of a spring morning on asphalt. Frank Delgado's face when she said we're doing okay. She was going to be okay. More than okay, eventually. But okay first. The okay was where she lived right now, and it was the right place to live, the place where nothing was taken for granted, and everything was understood to have been earned by the particular sequence of decisions that had led here, including, and especially, the one made at 2 in the morning in front of a county website, listing for a property assessed at $0. She turned onto the school road. Margot was standing at the pickup line with her backpack on both shoulders, which was the way she wore it when she was in a good mood. Both straps, deliberate, as opposed to the one-strap drag of a difficult day. She spotted Elena's car and started moving before it had fully stopped. She got in. She smelled like crayons and the particular brand of hand soap the school used. She put her seatbelt on and immediately said, "Devin says Saturday is definitely still good for fishing." Elena said, "Then Saturday is definitely still good for fishing." Margot said, "He says his dad has the kind of hook that's best for catfish specifically." Elena said, "Devin's dad is thorough." Margot said, "Devin says his dad says you have to respect the fish, even when you're trying to catch it." Elena pulled out of the school lot and onto the road, and thought about that for a moment. Respecting the thing, even while you were reaching for it. She thought about a county auction on a cold Tuesday morning. She thought about a sealed room and the care with which the boxes had been placed on their shelves, each one given its own space, each one treated with the understanding that what it held deserved that treatment. And she thought Jonas Pruitt, whoever he had been, had understood something about that. "Devin's dad sounds like a wise man," she said. Margot said, "He has a boat?" Elena said, "That helps." The house was on Birch Hollow Road, 3 miles outside of Hallows Bend proper, set back from the road, behind a stand of old oaks that had been dropping acorns on the same patch of ground since before the county was incorporated. It was not a large house. It was not a spectacular house. It had 4 bedrooms and a real kitchen and a porch that ran the length of the front and a backyard that backed up to a field where, in summer, something grew that Elena had not yet identified, but that turned gold in the late afternoon light, in a way that she found, every single time she saw it, quietly extraordinary. She had not bought the most expensive house she could afford. She had not bought the second most expensive, or the third. She had sat with Gerald Park and with a financial advisor named Constance Webb, a woman who wore sensible shoes and spoke about money with the same precision that Dr. Osei spoke about stones, and she had made decisions that Constance described as conservative and that Gerald described as wise and that Elena described as feeling right, which was the only metric she fully trusted anymore. The Birch Hollow house had cost $340,000. She had paid for it outright. There was no mortgage. There was no weekly rate. There was no crack in the paint above a window she had been looking at for 4 months. There was a real kitchen. Margot had walked through the empty house on the day they first saw it, moving from room to room with the focus of someone conducting an inspection, opening closet doors, testing light switches, pressing her palm flat against the kitchen counter as though taking its temperature. At the end of the tour, she had stood in the backyard and looked at the field behind it, and then looked at Elena and said, "This one." Elena had said, "Yeah, this one." They moved in on a Saturday in early June, which meant Devin's dad helped, because Devin's dad was the kind of man who showed up when something needed doing, the same way he showed up with the right hook for catfish specifically. He drove a truck that fit most of the furniture Elena had bought in a single load, modest pieces, chosen for function rather than display, a couch that was comfortable, a table that was real wood, beds that were actual beds rather than a single motel mattress shared between a mother and her daughter. Margot's room was the second one on the right. It had a window that looked out toward the oak trees. She had chosen the color for the walls herself, a blue that was almost green, the color of the creek in certain lights, and Elena had rolled it on herself over 2 evenings while Margot supervised with the authority of someone whose artistic vision was non-negotiable. Devin came over the following Saturday. He was a small, serious boy with his father's methodical quality, and he and Margot disappeared into the backyard immediately and were not heard from for 2 hours. Elena stood in the real kitchen and made lunch and listened to the sound of children in a yard and felt something she did not have an immediate word for, a filling in, as though a space that had been held open by the sustained effort of managing without had finally been allowed to close. She called her mother that evening. Her mother was no longer in the condemned building. She was in a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that had an elevator and a superintendent who responded to maintenance requests within 48 hours, a standard her mother had described, upon moving in, as almost suspicious in its competence. Elena paid the rent. She had also paid the back rent her mother owed on the previous place, and the medical bill that had been sitting in a drawer for 2 years, and the cost of getting her mother's car serviced, which had turned out to require more than a service and had instead required a different car entirely, a transaction that had made her mother cry in the dealership parking lot in a way that Elena suspected had nothing to do with the car. "How is it?" her mother said, meaning the house, meaning the life, meaning all of it. Elena looked out the kitchen window at the field going gold in the evening light. "It's good, Mama," she said. "It's really good." Her mother said, "I believe you this time." Elena said, "I know." There was a pause on the line, comfortable, the kind of silence that long relationships could hold without strain. Her mother said, "That building you bought, the mill." "Yes." "What are you going to do with it?" Elena had been thinking about this for months, not in the anxious way she had thought about things during the period when anxiety was the default mode, the constant low-frequency hum of not enough, but in the slower, a more deliberate way that became available when the immediate pressure was gone, and you could look at something from a distance and ask what it actually was and what it was actually for. She said, "I'm going to fix it." Her mother said, "Fix it how?" Elena said, "All the way." She had begun the process before the house on Birch Hollow Road, before the move, before Devin's dad and his truck. She had begun it in the weeks after the court ruling, when the legal situation had clarified enough to allow forward motion. She had called a millwright, not a contractor who did occasional mill work, but an actual millwright, of a man named Henry Bassett, who had spent 40 years restoring historic grist operations across the mid-Atlantic, and who arrived at Callow Creek in a truck that had seen more unpaved roads than Elena's Civic ever would, and who spent an entire afternoon walking the property and looking at the wheel and the mechanism and the stonework before he said a single word about what could be done. What he said, when he finally spoke, was, "This is a good one." Elena said, "Can it be restored?" Henry said, "Everything can be restored. The question is whether it's worth it." Elena said, "Is it worth it?" Henry looked at the wheel, at the creek, at the building with its stone walls, and its century and a half of standing. He looked at it the way she imagined he looked at all of them, with the particular attention of someone who understood that buildings like this were not replaceable, that the skill and the stone and the specific arrangement of a working mill beside a living creek was a combination that did not repeat itself, that each one was singular in the way that genuinely handmade things were singular, not because they were perfect, but because they were specific, shaped by the specific decisions of specific people in response to the specific conditions of a specific place. "Yes," he said, "it's worth it." The restoration was Henry's design and his crew's execution, but it was Elena's vision, which was to say her vision was simple: make it work again. Not a museum, not a heritage attraction with velvet ropes and informational placards. A working mill, a mill that turned, a mill where the wheel moved and the stones ground, and the creek did what the creek had been doing beside this building since 1871. Henry said that was the right vision. The work took 8 months. It was not cheap. Elena had set aside a specific portion of the funds from the diamond sale for the mill's restoration, a number that made Constance Webb wince slightly, and then nod when Elena explained her reasoning. The wheel required new paddles fabricated from white oak, sourced from a supplier Henry had worked with for 20 years, who understood the difference between wood that looked right and wood that was right. The axle had to be remachined, the ironwork assessed and partially replaced. The millstone was the greatest challenge and the greatest triumph. The cracked halves that had rested in the pit since 1991 were beyond repair, but Henry located a matched pair of French burr stones in an estate sale in Pennsylvania. The same composition and diameter, dressed in the traditional pattern by a craftsman who was one of perhaps 30 people in the country who still knew how to do it. When the stones arrived and were set in the pit, and the iron mounting was finished, and the water diversion channel was cleared and redirected to give the wheel its full head of water, Henry called Elena and said, "Come see." She drove to the mill on a gray October morning. Margot was in school. The air was cool, and the creek was high from recent rain. She parked on the gravel and walked to the south side of the building where the wheel was and stood at a distance from it. Henry was standing near the channel control. He looked at her. She nodded. He opened the gate. The water came. It came down the channel in the way that water moved when it had been waiting, with force and intention and the particular sound of something doing exactly what it was built to do. It hit the paddles of the wheel, and the wheel shuddered and then began to turn. Slowly at first, finding the rhythm of itself, the iron axle moving in its housing, the sound of the gears engaging deep inside the building, a low and purposeful grind that carried through the stone walls and into the air. Then the wheel was turning. Fully. The paddles catching the water and carrying it around, and releasing it, and catching the next, the whole mechanism alive in the way that only mechanical things with moving parts were alive. The aliveness of function, of design meeting purpose. Elena stood and watched it. She had not expected to cry. She did not think of herself as someone who cried at the sight of machinery, however well restored. But the wheel turning was not machinery exactly. Or it was machinery, and also something else, something that had to do with the particular quality of watching something return to what it had always been meant to be, and the distance between where it had been and where it was now, and the unlikely chain of events that connected those 2 points, which included a county website at 2 a.m. and $11 and a cold Tuesday in March, and a composition notebook and 40 boxes on stone shelves, and a woman named Dr. Osei, who moved through her work with precision, and a judge who read documents carefully, and a 7-year-old who pressed her face against a car window and asked about fish. She stood and watched the wheel turn. Henry stood beside her, not too close, giving her the space that the moment seemed to require. After a while, he said, "She runs well." Elena said, "Yes." He said, "Stones need a few weeks of break-in running before she'll produce quality flour. But she'll produce." Elena said, "Good." They stood a while longer. "One more thing," Henry said. He led her around to the south side of the building and pointed upward, to a section of the exterior wall near the waterline where the stone was different, lighter, newer looking, carefully matched, but not quite matching. We had to repoint that section when we were working on the water diversion. Whoever laid those stones originally did exceptional work. The integrity was almost perfect after all this time. He paused. "Just thought you should see it." Elena looked at the stones, the old ones and the new ones, the seam between them barely visible, the repair made with care, with attention to the original, honoring the thing that had been there while allowing it to continue. She thought about Jonas Pruitt, laying stones in 1871. She thought about the word integrity, almost perfect after all this time. She said, "Thank you, Henry," he said. Thank you for letting us do it right." The town had been watching all of this from varying distances. Hollow's Bend was not a place that generated dramatic news often, and the story of the mill had moved through it in the way that significant local events moved through small communities, which was thoroughly and from every possible angle, and with a range of interpretation that had more to do with who was doing the interpreting than with the facts of the matter. Well, there were people who had been at the courthouse auction on that Tuesday in March. 3 of them, besides Carl Dukes, the auctioneer, had stood on those steps when Parcel 47 was called. None of them had bid. In the months after the news of the discovery broke, Elena had heard different accounts of why they hadn't, filtered through Rosalind and through the ordinary osmosis of small-town information flow. One of them, a man named Dale Sutter, who ran a property investment operation out of an office on the main street, had apparently told people that he had looked at the mill listing and dismissed it because the road access was seasonal and the structure would require too much remediation to be profitable. He said this in the weeks after the regional newspaper story, before the numbers became public, in the tone of someone explaining a reasonable business decision. After the numbers became public, Dale Sutter had less to say about his reasoning and more to say about the fact that the auction process had perhaps not been properly publicized, a complaint he made to the county commissioners in a meeting that Elena heard about secondhand, and that the commissioners apparently addressed by pointing out that the auction had been publicized in exactly the manner required by law for 11 consecutive weeks. She did not think much about Dale Sutter. He had made a calculation, and the calculation had been wrong, and that was the entirety of his story as far as she was concerned. People made wrong calculations. She had made plenty of her own. What she thought about more was the conversation she had with Carl Dukes, the auctioneer, about 2 months after the ruling. He had found her at the mill one afternoon when she was there checking on the restoration progress, and he had stood at the edge of the property for a moment before approaching, as though asking permission from the building itself. He was a careful man. He had the face she remembered, the face of someone who had seen everything and found none of it particularly surprising. But there was something different in it that afternoon, a quality she didn't have an immediate name for. He said, "I heard it's going well." She said, "It is." He looked at the wheel, which was turning that day, Henry running it through a test cycle. He watched it for a while. He said, "I've been doing this 22 years. I never had a result like this come out of a parcel." Elena said, "I imagine not." He said, $9. She said, $9. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in something more like appreciation, the way you appreciated a thing that had revealed itself to be more than you'd expected. "Good for you," he said, and meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "Thank you, Carl," she said. He nodded and walked back to his truck and drove away, and Elena watched him go and thought that this was what most people were, actually, when the situation didn't require them to be anything else. Decent. Capable of genuine response to a genuine thing. The people who were not that way were fewer than she had expected, given everything. There was Dale Sutter with his commissioners' meeting. There was a woman named Patricia Hughes, who had apparently told several people that there was something suspicious about how Elena had found out about the auction, implying, without quite stating, that the $9 outcome had involved some form of insider information, a suggestion that collapsed immediately under the weight of the public record, but that circulated briefly in certain social circles before dissolving. There was a man whose connection to the Pruitt estate was distant and social rather than legal, who wrote a letter to the local paper suggesting that the court ruling had been unjust, a letter the paper printed and that generated 3 response letters, 2 of which disagreed with it, and 1 of which agreed, ratios that Elena found approximately accurate to her experience of human opinion distribution on most topics. None of it touched her the way it might have touched her before. She was aware of that change in herself and had thought about it enough to understand where it came from. The things that had the power to harm her were different now. Not smaller, necessarily, but different. More specific and more real. A sick child. A friendship broken by misunderstanding. The ordinary, irreversible losses that constituted a life. The opinion of Dale Sutter about the auction process was not in that category. It had never been in that category. She had simply been, before, in a position where almost everything felt like it could hurt, because she was using everything she had just to stay standing. And when you were using everything to stay standing, you had nothing left over for perspective. She had perspective now. The mill opened on a Saturday in April, which was the first Saturday after Henry declared the stones broken in and the operation ready for public demonstration. Elena had not planned a grand opening. She had not rented a tent or hired a caterer or invited the regional press. She had put a notice in the county newsletter that the Callow Creek Gristmill would be grinding on the first Saturday of April, 10 in the morning, and that anyone who wanted to come and watch was welcome. 63 people came. This was more than Elena had expected, though in retrospect, she understood why. People came because they were curious, yes, and because the story of the mill had moved through the county in the way significant stories moved, and they wanted to see the ending of it, the physical and functional ending, the wheel turning. But they also came because working grist mills were rare now, genuinely rare, and the sound and sight of one operating, of stone against stone and water, doing its ancient work through mechanism, was something that most of them had never seen, and would not see again in this particular form. Henry ran the demonstration. He explained the mechanics as he went, the overshot wheel, the water diversion, the gear train, the millstone rotation, the way the grain fed down through the eye of the stone and emerged as flour from the periphery, finer or coarser, depending on the gap between the stones, adjusted by a mechanism of beautiful simplicity that had not fundamentally changed in 2,000 years of milling. He was a good explainer, patient and specific, and the crowd watched and listened with the attention that people gave to things that were genuinely interesting, rather than merely scheduled to be interesting. When the first bag of flour came off the stones, rough ground, the color of wheat, and the smell of something ancient and nourishing, Henry held it up. The crowd applauded. Elena stood at the edge of the gathered people and watched them clap, and felt the particular warmth of a thing that had come to its right conclusion, not the triumphant warmth of victory, which was louder and shorter, but the quieter, sustained warmth of rightness, of a thing being what it was supposed to be. Margot was beside her. Margot had brought Devon, who had brought a notebook in which he was writing things down with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand the operational mechanics of a gristmill before he left. Devon's dad was there too, standing near the back with his arms crossed and an expression of genuine satisfaction on his face that Elena found, every time she glanced at it, completely heartening. At one point, Margot looked up at her and said, "Are you happy?" Elena considered the question with the honesty it deserved, as she had learned to consider Margot's questions, which were frequently more precise than they appeared. "Yes," she said. "I think that's exactly what this is." Margot nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. The flour went home with people who asked for it, one I shared out from the first bag in paper cups that Henry had brought for exactly this purpose, and by early afternoon, the crowd had thinned to a handful of people who simply didn't want to leave yet, who were still standing near the wheel, watching it turn, and listening to the creak and the grind of the stones, and the sound of the mechanism that had been still for 30 years, and was still no longer. Gerald Park came. She had not invited him specifically, but she had told him when it was. and he arrived mid-morning and stayed for an hour, watching the demonstration with his hands in his coat pockets and a quality of quiet satisfaction on his face that she appreciated because it was not about the legal outcome, which was his professional success as much as hers, but about the mill itself, about the thing that the outcome had made possible. Oh, she stood beside him for a few minutes near the wheel, and they both watched it turn. He said, "It's a remarkable place." She said, "It is," he said. "What happens now? With the operation?" She had thought about this carefully. "It's going to run," she said. "Properly. We've worked out an arrangement with 2 farms in the county to supply grain. The flour will sell locally, markets, restaurants, direct. It won't make significant money. That's not the point." He nodded. "The point," she said, "is that it runs, that the wheel turns, that this thing that was here and was built to do something continues to do it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Jonas Pruitt built it to do something," she said. "He did. And someone found what he left in it and used it to give it back to itself." She had not thought of it in exactly those words, but they were the right words. She could hear that immediately. Someone found what he left and used it to give it back to itself. The inheritance running in both directions, forward and back. The money enabling the restoration that honored the thing the money had been hidden inside for 150 years. She said, "That's it. That's exactly it." Rosalind was there too, of course. She arrived late, slightly breathless, having come from a morning obligation that had run long, and she found Elena near the creek and put her arm around her shoulders, and they stood together watching the wheel for a while without speaking, or which was one of the things Elena valued most about Rosalind, her understanding that certain moments did not require words to be inhabited properly. After a while, Rosalind said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" Elena said, "What?" "That first day, when you forced the door on the chamber, the pry bar. You used that pry bar for 45 minutes. It was a very stubborn latch. I thought we were going to break the door. We almost did." Rosalind shook her head. "And then it just opened." Elena looked at the wheel. "And then it just opened." They stood in the April sun beside the creek that ran the same way it had always run, and the wheel turned, and the stones ground. And inside the building, the flour was being produced from the first grain of the season, with the particular smell of something real and useful. And the afternoon light was the kind of light that April made when it was being generous, warm and specific, and falling on everything without preference. Darlene had come from out of state for the opening. She had driven 9 hours and arrived the night before, and slept on the actual couch in Elena's actual living room in the house on Birch Hollow Road. And in the morning, she had stood in the real kitchen and drunk coffee and said, "This is a good kitchen, Elena." And Elena had said, "I know." And Darlene had said, "No. I mean, this is a really good kitchen." And Elena had said, "I know, Darlene." And Darlene had said, "I'm just saying." At the mill, Darlene had toured everything twice. She had gone into the Waterwheel chamber. She had stood at the top of the stone steps that led down to the sealed room, which was no longer sealed, but which had been left otherwise as it had been found. A decision Elena had made deliberately, the shelves still there, the space still exactly shaped, the way it had been shaped, by whoever had last used it. Darlene had stood there for a long time without speaking. When she came back out, she found Elena near the wheel and stood beside her and said, "You know what the thing is?" Elena said, "What?" Darlene said, "You raised your hand." Elena said, "Yes." "That's the whole thing. You just raised your hand. That's the whole thing." Darlene was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't raise mine." Elena said, You didn't have $11, Darlene said. I had 12. Elena laughed. It was the real kind, the undefended kind, the kind that came from somewhere underneath everything, from the same place that Margot's undefended smile came from, and Darlene laughed too, and they stood beside the wheel in the April light and let it happen. It was still happening when Margot appeared at Elena's elbow, with Devon behind her, and Devon's notebook open to a page of diagrams. Margot said, Devon has a question about the gear ratio. Elena said, Devon should ask Henry. Devon said, I already asked Henry. I have a follow-up question. Elena said, Devon, this is my sister Darlene. Devon looked at Darlene with the serious assessment he brought to most things and said, Do you know about gear ratios? Darlene said, I know some things about gear ratios. Devon said, Okay, and opened his notebook and began. Elena watched Darlene lean over Devon's notebook with the genuine interest that Darlene brought to most things when she was not being practical, and felt, with the force of something long deferred, the particular gratitude of having a sister who drove 9 hours for you and engaged with a 7-year-old serious friend's gear ratio questions, and stood beside a mill wheel with you and said, You raised your hand, as though that was the complete account of the situation, which it almost was. In the weeks and months that followed the opening, the mill ran. Not every day, but regularly, with a schedule that Henry supervised and that Elena had published in the county newsletter, along with the information about where the flour could be purchased. The farms supplying grain were steady. The local restaurants that had expressed interest followed through. A small market in the county seat took a standing weekly order. The economics of it were exactly what she had said they would be. Not significant, not the point. The point was the wheel. Elena visited regularly, not every day, but often enough that the drive became one of the rhythms of her week, a fixed point in the calendar that she found herself looking forward to, with the particular anticipation of someone returning somewhere they had come to love in the specific and unglamorous way you loved things you had chosen and worked for. She would park on the gravel and walk around the south side and check that the wheel was turning if it was a running day. And if it wasn't a running day, she would stand beside the creek and listen to the water and look at the building. And sometimes Margot came. Sometimes she came alone. Both were right. On an afternoon in late June, almost exactly 15 months after the auction, she sat on the low stone wall near the creek with the composition notebook open on her knee. She had been carrying it since March of the previous year, filling it with the ordered record of what had happened, the notes and dates and exact words that she had been writing down since the beginning, because she had learned that the record mattered, that things written in order and held with care had a staying power that memory alone could not provide. She looked at the first entry. Callow Creek Gristmill, parcel 47, $9. March. She looked at the last entry, written that morning. Wheel running. Darlene called. Margot's room painted. Devon's gear ratio diagram is on the refrigerator. The flour is good. She sat for a while with the notebook open, the creek moving beside her, the wheel turning above it, the stone walls holding their particular kind of light. She thought about everything that was in between those two entries. The $11 and the motel and the granola bars and the crack in the paint above the window. The pry bar, the stone steps, the 40 boxes. Dr. Osei turning a diamond in her fingers in the light of a flashlight in a sealed room. Gerald Park pausing before he said the number. Her mother's face in the kitchen of the condemned apartment. Darlene saying, "You always said it was going to be okay." She thought about Jonas Pruitt in 1871, laying stone beside a creek, building something to last. She thought about Clarence and his letter in 1952, and Robert, who had read it, and eventually carried the knowledge alone, until there was no one left to carry it to. She thought about the wax seal crumbling under her fingers. She closed the notebook. The wheel turned. The water moved. The stones ground in the building above her. The sound of the mechanism carrying through the stone walls, the way it had been built to carry, through everything that stone and iron and the particular precision of millwright craft could be asked to carry. She sat in the June light and let the sound of it settle into her, the way sound settled when you had been in a place long enough to stop hearing it as new. Then she opened the notebook again and wrote one more line at the bottom of the last page. It was a good $9. She closed it. She stood up. She put the notebook in her bag. She walked to the car and got in, and sat for a moment with the windows down and the sound of the creak and the wheel coming in on the warm air. She started the engine. She drove home. Margot was in the backyard with Devin, who had apparently brought his notebook again, and Devin's dad was on the porch talking to Darlene, who had extended her visit by 3 days because there was no particular urgency in the 9 hours back, and the real kitchen made good coffee. The field behind the house was doing its thing with the late afternoon light, turning the particular gold that it turned when the angle was right, the gold that had no precise name, but that Elena had found, every single time she saw it, worth stopping for. She stopped. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched Margot and Devin in the field, and the light doing what it did, and felt the ordinary weight of an ordinary evening in a life that had been built from an unlikely sequence of small and large decisions, from an auction on a cold Tuesday morning, and a raised hand, and a pry bar, and a flashlight, and 45 minutes of persistence in front of a rusted latch that finally gave. She felt it settle. All of it. She breathed. Then Margot saw her and waved, and Elena waved back, and Devin looked up from his notebook with the serious expression he brought to everything, and nodded in the manner of someone acknowledging a peer, and Elena nodded back, and Darlene called from the porch. "Coffee's fresh," and Elena said, "Coming," and she walked across the yard toward the house that was hers, snow on the ground that was solid beneath her feet, in the light that asked nothing of her except that she stand in it. She stood in it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. There were things she had not expected about the aftermath of it. Small things and large things both. The way the unexpected always distributed itself without regard for scale or category. She had not expected, for instance, how often she would think about the room itself, separate from its contents, the room as a room. The low ceiling and the stone shelves, and the way the flashlight had caught the surface of the first stone she held and scattered the light across the walls. When she had expected to think about the diamonds, she had expected to think about the number. She had not expected to think about the room. She thought about it often. About what it had meant to be in a space that had been sealed from the world for 100 years, the quality of the air in it, the density of the silence, the feeling of standing somewhere that had held its secret through every change that a century required of the world around it, while itself remaining unchanged. There was something in that constancy that she found, the more she thought about it, instructive. Not in the sentimental way that people sometimes applied lessons from inanimate things, but in a simpler and more honest way. The room had been built to hold something valuable, and it had done that, completely. For as long as was required. She had tried to do that too, not in her own way. To hold the things that mattered through the years, when holding them required everything she had. Margot. The belief that it was going to be okay. The hand raised at $9. She was not a sealed stone room. She was a 31-year-old woman who had made impulsive decisions her whole life and occasionally gotten lucky in ways that looked, afterward, less like luck than like the compounded result of paying enough attention at the right moments. She knew the difference. But she also understood that Jonas Pruitt had paid attention too in 1871, and that his attention had been what made her attention possible, and that the chain connecting those two facts ran through 150 years of a building standing beside a creek, doing what it was built to do. She thought all of this on a Thursday afternoon in July, and sitting on the low stone wall with the notebook and the wheel turning and the water moving. And she wrote some of it down and left some of it unwritten because certain things were right in the thinking of them and didn't need to be more than that. Constance Webb had helped her establish a structure for the money that Constance described as measured and that Elena described as enough. There was a trust for Margot, substantial, structured to grow and to be available when she needed it, and not before. There was a fund for her mother, managed simply, sufficient. There was a portion set aside for the mill's ongoing operation and eventual repair, a buffer against the future maintenance that old stone buildings always eventually required. There was the house. There were the ordinary expenses of an ordinary life, conducted without the constant weight of not enough. The rest she had given away, not all at once, not without careful thought, but steadily, over the course of the months following the settlement, to the county food bank that had fed her and Margot through 2 months of the previous winter, when the part-time hours at the grocery had dropped and the motel weekly rate had consumed most of what remained. To the after-school program that Margot attended and that operated, Elena had discovered, on a budget that required annual renewal of a grant that was not guaranteed, and that a reliable private donation could make independent, to a scholarship fund at the community college in Renner, directed at students who were working while enrolled, the ones who took the early morning classes and the late evening classes and ate from the vending machines between, the ones whose circumstances were not obstacles to their determination, but were simply the conditions within which their determination operated. She did not announce these gifts. She did not seek recognition for them or explanation of them. She had talked with Constance about the structure and with Gerald about the legal aspects, and that was the entirety of the conversation she needed to have. The money had come from a sealed room in a mill, and it went to the places it needed to go, and that was a complete enough account of the transaction. Gerald Park had said, at their last meeting before the gift structure was finalized, "You could keep more," she had said. "I have enough." He had looked at her for a moment with the expression he occasionally used when he was assessing something that fell outside his professional categories. Then he said, "Yes, I think you do." Rosalind had asked her once, in the weeks after the ruling, whether she felt different. Not about the money, not about the situation, but about herself. Whether the discovery had changed who she was in some fundamental way. Elena had thought about it honestly. "I don't think it changed who I am," she said. "I think it changed what I'm able to do with who I am, which is something, but the who is the same." Rosalind had considered this and said, "The who raised her hand at $9. Elena said, "Yes." Rosalind said, "That's a pretty good who." Elena said, "She has her moments." The composition notebook filled up in September. She bought a second one, the same kind, a composition notebook with a black and white speckled cover and the same dimensions as the first, from the same drugstore where she had bought Margot's granola bars through 2 winters. She put the first one in the drawer of the desk in the house on Birch Hollow Road, the one that had replaced the small desk in the motel room, larger and made of actual wood, positioned so that it caught the morning light from the east window. She opened the second notebook to the first page. She wrote the date. She sat for a moment, looking at the blank page. Then she wrote, "The wheel is running." She wrote it and looked at it, and thought it was as good a place to begin as any. The wheel turning, the water moving, the stones grinding in the building that Jonas Pruitt had built in 1871, beside the creek in a county with 1,700 people, the building that had stood through everything 150 years, contained, and would stand through everything the next 150 would bring. The wheel turning now as it had been built to turn, the creek doing what it had always done. The wheel was running. She closed the notebook. She picked up her coffee from the desk and walked to the window and stood in the morning light and looked at the field going gold at the edge of the yard, which was hers, and the oaks past it, which had been dropping their acorns on the same patch of ground since before the county was incorporated, and the road beyond, which ran to the county road, which ran to the highway, which ran to the world. She stood in the light. She drank her coffee. She breathed. The second autumn was different from the first, not dramatically, not in ways that a stranger would have noticed, but in the particular quality of difference that was available only to someone who had lived both autumns in the same place, which was the difference between the thing remembered and the thing present. The way that repetition over time accumulated into something you could call familiarity, which was another word for home. She drove the county road to the mill on a morning in October, when the leaves were turning, and the creek was high from early rain, and the light came through the trees in the specific broken way it came, when the leaves were thin enough to let it through, but still present enough to filter it, turning everything amber and gold, and the particular red that the maples made in this county when the season was right. She parked on the gravel. The wheel was turning. This was a running day, Henry's crew having opened the channel early for the fall grain. She could hear it from the car, the familiar sound of mechanism and water, and the creek doing its part beneath them, the whole assembly alive in the way she never stopped being glad to hear. She got out of the car and stood in the amber light. She thought, I paid $9 for this. She thought it the way she often thought it, not with disbelief anymore. The disbelief had long since settled into something more permanent and more useful, but with a specific quality of attention, a noticing of the fact, as though for the first time, a refusal to let it become ordinary through repetition. $9. This creek, this wheel, this light, the sealed room and what it held. The sealed room now open, the stone steps leading down to empty shelves, the boxes gone into certified channels, the diamonds dispersed into the world through the hands of professionals who understood their value, and into transactions that produced numbers Elena still found, when she allowed herself to consider them, genuinely difficult to hold in ordinary consciousness. $312 million. Final realized value. After the sale process had run its full course, after the exceptional stones had been auctioned, and the lesser material had moved through the appropriate wholesale channels, and all the costs of certification and legal process and professional assessment, and everything else had been accounted for, and the Pruitt settlement of 8% had been paid, and the taxes, which were significant, and which Constance had navigated with the precision Elena had come to expect from her. $312 million. For $9. She had stopped trying to understand that ratio in the way you tried to understand mathematical relationships, looking for the logic that connected one number to the other. There was no logic of that kind. The connection was not mathematical. It was geological and historical and personal and accidental and deliberate all at once, the connection between a cold Tuesday morning and a sealed room and a woman who had $11 and raised her hand. You could not logic your way to understanding that. What you could do was stand beside a turning wheel in the October light and let it be what it was, which was true, which was hers, which was the result of the specific sequence of things she had done and not done, chosen and not chosen, seen and acted on, and held through the years when holding was the hardest work available. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside and checked on the stones with Henry, and talked about the fall grain schedule and drank a cup of coffee from the thermos. Henry's crew brought on running days and listened to the wheel and the grind and the creak, and when she left, she said goodbye to the building the way she said goodbye to it every time, which was without words, just a moment of looking at the wheel before she turned toward the car. The wheel turned. She drove home. The field behind the house on Birch Hollow Road was doing something complicated with the light. The gold was different in October than it was in June. Deeper, more amber, weighted with the knowledge that the season was ending, that what it was doing now, it would not do again for another year. Elena stood at the kitchen window, looking at it while the coffee finished, and Margot was getting ready for school, in the room with the blue-green walls, moving through the morning with the focused efficiency of someone who had places to be and plans for getting there. She heard Margot's footsteps on the stairs, and she heard Margot's backpack, both straps, the good mood sound of it. She poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for Darlene, who was visiting again, 3 days this time, sleeping in the guest room that had been repainted over the summer in the color Darlene had chosen, which was a warm yellow that Elena privately thought was too bright, but which Darlene defended as scientifically proven to promote optimism, a claim Elena had not verified, but was willing to accept. Margot came into the kitchen and took an apple from the bowl on the counter and said, "Devon's dad is taking us fishing Saturday." Elena said, "Good." Margot said, "Devon says the catfish are bigger in fall." Elena said, "Devon may be right." Margot said, "Devon's dad says the limestone is key." Elena handed Darlene her coffee as she appeared in the doorway, still in her robe, her hair in the morning state that she would address before leaving the house, but had not yet addressed. Darlene took the coffee and looked at Margot and said, "Devon's dad sounds like a very informed person." Margot said, "He has a boat." Darlene said, "That tends to be correlated with knowing things about fish." Margot appeared to find this a satisfactory response and left for the school bus with her apple and her backpack on both shoulders, the door closing behind her, with the ordinary sound of an ordinary morning, departure from an ordinary house on an ordinary road, in a county with 1,700 people, and a mill beside a creek and a wheel that turned. Elena and Darlene stood in the kitchen with their coffee. The field did its October thing with the light, and Darlene said, "You good?" Elena said, "Yeah." Darlene said, "Really?" Elena said, "Really." Darlene nodded. She drank her coffee. She looked out the window at the field. After a moment, she said, "You raised your hand." Elena said, "I raised my hand." They stood in the morning light. The coffee was good. The kitchen was real. The wheel was turning 45 minutes away beside the creek that ran the same way it had always run, and would run the same way tomorrow, and the day after that, and through the winter when the wheel would rest, and through the spring when it would turn again, and through every season that followed, the water doing what water did, the stone doing what stone did. The mill built in 1871 by a man who understood that some things were worth building, to last still standing where he had built it, wheel turning, on stones, grinding, the creek beneath moving with the patience of things that measured time in centuries rather than years, and found, in the turning and the grinding and the moving, not drama, but something quieter and more enduring, something that had always been there, something that was still there, something that would keep being there. The wheel turned. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.